Okay, so who were the deists or the left-wingers, the humanists? Well, we know it was Thomas Jefferson, right? Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin were probably the only two deists or humanists that were in the Constitutional Convention. And yet, even though they were on the left wing of their time, when Thomas Jefferson was president in 1804-ish, somewhere around there, he actually was holding services every Sunday in the Capitol, religious Christian worship services, and he required that all of the children in Washington, D.C. be taught to read by using the Bible. And he had Congress printing Bibles, so he was the left-winger, and that's where he was. That's what I'm talking about with this marination thing. Ben Franklin was another of the humanists who was not really a Christian, and yet he was very steeped in the Bible. He was actually a really good friend of George Whitefield. And some of you may, and I'm going to throw out some of these names and hope that you'll pick them up in the next couple of weeks from Glenn Beck. But George Whitefield was a preacher. He actually came to America to start an orphanage in Georgia. And he went up and down the colonies in the early, like around 1760s. And he was raising money for the orphanage, and he met Ben Franklin and Ben Franklin really liked him, gave him a lot of money for the orphanage. And Ben Franklin sponsored a lot of his preaching. And George Whitefield started a revival in America. He was the guy who could preach and be heard a mile away without a microphone. And he was a very good preacher. And so just before the Revolution, George Whitefield brought the colonies together by having a revival and bringing them all back into the same godly, Bible-based religion. And that's the reason when Boston was attacked, with the Minutemen, all the other colonies came to their aid because all the colonies had been brought together through the committees of correspondence with Sam Adams and through the preaching of George Whitefield. So he was very important in all that, and Ben Franklin really liked him, even though Ben Franklin said he was not really a Christian. He was a deist, wind up the clock and run down by itself. So, but Ben Franklin had a biblical worldview, and one of the things that he said when he was talking about the inherent sinfulness of man, and our whole Constitution, checks and balances, is based on the biblical notion of the inherent sinfulness of man. That's the reason we have to have checks and balances, because I don't care who we elect to Congress, present company I'm sure included. They are just human beings, and they are sinners, and if the people don't watch them like a hawk, they are going to be bad. I mean, we're humans, right? They can also be good if they're really connected to God and doing what God says, but our Constitution was based on the fact that they're probably really going to be bad. And so you've got three branches of government, you've got, state, city, and federal, you've got everybody watching everybody else, and the reason was because people like James Madison, our right-winger, had gone to school at Princeton University when Princeton University was very Christian, and a guy named John Witherspoon taught him, and it was John Witherspoon's contribution to the Constitution that man was inherently sinful, which of course he got from Genesis in the Bible, and unless you accounted for that, government was not going to work. And so that's the reason that our Constitution, the basic underlying fact of the Constitution is that man is sinful and needs to be watched all the time. So we can't go back to sleep even if we get good people in Washington, because we got to make sure they stay good. We can never go to sleep again if we want to keep our freedom, and that's the really important message. So here's what Ben Franklin said, and this sounds like he could have said this yesterday. Talking about the sinfulness of man, he said, "There is scarce a king in 100 who would not, if he could, follow the example of Pharaoh, get first all the people's money, then all their lands, and then make them and their children servants forever." Who does that remind you of? And during the time that the Constitution was starting to fall apart, and there was a time when everybody almost left because they could not agree with each other, the southern states against the northern states, and all down the line. This is what Ben Franklin said, and I think this is a word from Ben Franklin that we really have to take to heart today. He said, and he rose and he said this to the entire assembly there in the Constitutional Convention, and he said, "In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of our danger, we had daily prayer in this room for the divine protection." This is Ben Franklin, the deist, the left-winger. We had daily prayer in this room for the divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. That's what they call God, the superintending providence. To that kind of providence, we owe this happy opportunity of consulting in peace on the means of establishing our future national felicity. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? Or do we imagine we no longer need his assistance? I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men, and if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this, and I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. That was the left-wing guy at the convention. So he was marinated in the Christian worldview, and our government was built on biblical principles, and unless we get back to the biblical principles and get back to the Bible, we cannot build this nation over again. And not everybody has to be Christian. Not everybody at that time was Christian, but we need those biblical principles because that's where we got freedom from. I mean, do you realize, they call religious liberty the first freedom. Do you realize that the reason that religious liberty is the first freedom is because God in the Bible does not want people to be forced to worship him? He wants us to have a choice as to whether we're going to worship him or not. He wants us to have freedom, to use our minds to discern whether or not we want to believe in him and to believe in the Bible. And because God gave us that freedom to choose him or not to choose him, our founders rationalized that we also should have freedom in every area of our lives. And it is religious liberty that is called the first freedom, because without religious liberty, without religion, we cannot have freedom. It's impossible to have freedom without liberty. Look at the Islamic nations of the world. Look at Saudi Arabia. You can't be anything but a Muslim there. And all in the Soviet Union years ago, you couldn't be a Christian. You had to be a secularist. So it's only in America, and it's only because of God and the biblical principles of freedom of religion that we have any freedom. And unless we use freedom of religion and religion as the first building block of this opportunity to rebuild our nation, it's not going to work, just as Benjamin Franklin said. If we do not ground ourselves in the sacred writings, we're going to be no better than building the Tower of Babel all over again. And this is what I don't want the Tea Party movement to lose. Because if we rebuild without biblical principles, it's not going to work, because it's only the biblical principles that made it work in the first place. George Washington was the moderate of this group. And he of course, was a general. And do you realize that George Washington believed that God had miraculously won the Revolutionary War? And he said it over and over and over again. George Washington never won a battle in the Revolutionary War. The Americans never won a battle. Now, somebody did. I was speaking at the Daughters of the American Revolution, giving this talk a couple of months ago, and one lady came up to me and said, yes, there was one battle in Virginia that Washington won. I said, okay, one, I'll give you one. But otherwise, you know how he did it? He fought and fought and fought, and then he ran away. And then he trusted God to do the rest. I mean, you remember the story of the fog in New York Harbor? I mean, the American Army was about to be wiped out by the British, and they were all there on this little island, and the British could have just come and boom, they'd have been all dead. And God brought a fog, and they all escaped on little boats across the river. And the fog lifted as soon as the last guy got on the other shore, and the British came the next day to wipe them out, and sure enough, they weren't there. They didn't win that battle, but God did. So here's what Washington